Chapter 4. Countries arm. Nationalism, as preached by Giuseppe Mazzini and his disciples in 19th-century Europe, was supposed to bring peace. Instead it brought war. So it was with an even more profound development of the time, the energy revolution, that was made possible when Michael Faraday learned how to generate electricity. Practically limitless power was the new thing that made almost all else possible. Henry Adams, historian and prophet, the American Janus who saw both behind and ahead, identified it. Marveling at the dynamos he saw at the Chicago, 1893, and Paris, 1900, World Fairs, he speculated that they might render all past human history obsolete. It would upset schoolmasters, he observed, but professorial necks had been broken a few times before since Europe began, and of these few times, the nearest approach to the revolution of 1900 was that of 310, when Constantine set up the cross. Indeed, the rays of electricity were something that Adams found almost supernatural, an energy like that of the cross. It was natural that Adams should be optimistic. He was a child of the century that believed history was the story of progress. Before the 19th century began, men had looked backward to a golden age. Now they looked forward to it. Europeans and Americans were fascinated by speculations about the future. A new genre of fantasy fictions catered to their tastes. Jules Verne and H. G. Wells were the pioneers in creating tales of scientific and technological marvels, of flying machines, life below the oceans, and interplanetary travel. The focus on all the wonders that the future held in store for an empowered humanity may have been somewhat unbalanced. Only a few saw that the dark side of the otherwise Promethean story was that the human race made use of its amazing possibilities by calling forth explosive new powers of destruction. In an often quoted letter written when war came in 1914, Henry James, the famous American novelist resident in England, wrote, "The plunge of civilization into this abyss of blood and darkness, is a thing that so gives away the whole long age during which we have supposed the world to be, with whatever abatement, gradually bettering, that to have to take it all now for what the treacherous years were all the while really making for and meaning is too tragic for any words." Science had not made human beings more peaceful and civilized. It had betrayed such hopes and instead had made it possible for armies to be more savagely destructive than warriors of earlier times could have dreamed of being. What Europe was building up toward was not a better world, but a giant smash-up, as, in the first 20th century war among modern industrial societies, the accumulated explosive power that advanced science had developed was concentrated on the goal of mass destruction. Why did contemporaries believe that they were headed for a more peaceful world? How could they dismiss the possibility of a war among European powers from their fears and their minds? Why were they taken by surprise by the outbreak of war? Did they never look to see what their leading industry was manufacturing? Looking back, perhaps the most remarkable feature of the pre-war international landscape was the accelerating arms race. The German armaments firm Krupp was the largest single business in Europe. Its giant rivals, Skoda, Creusot, Schneider, and Vickers Maxim, also were enormous. In large part, in the new industrial age, Europe's business had become the business of preparing to fight a war. In retrospect, the intense arms race was the most visible feature of Europe's political landscape in those antebellum years. It is odd that the man in the street did not see this with equal clarity at the time. The European war economy had become immense in scale, but it did not bring security. A technological breakthrough such as Britain's development of the dreadnought, rendering all existing battleships obsolete, not merely forced a country to write off its previous efforts and investments, but risked leaving it naked before its enemies during the years required to catch up. Each adjusted its military manpower requirements, its blend of regular army, conscripts, and reserves of one sort or another, to at least match the levels of its potential adversaries. The unrelenting competitiveness achieved the opposite of what was intended. The build-up in the armed forces was intended to achieve national security, but instead undermined it. The arms race, driven by mutual fears, ended by making all the great powers of Europe radically insecure. All the great powers, even Russia, after the 1905 revolution, were relatively open societies in which the appropriation of funds by parliaments for military purposes could be scrutinized by rival states, whose analyses were not infrequently colored by alarmism. As military programs mandated by legislation embodied schedules, countries were aware of one another's production timetables for armaments and therefore could be tempted to launch a preemptive strike. An innovation dating from the 19th century was that the armed forces of the respective countries now routinely prepared contingency plans for making war on their rivals should hostilities break out. These, of course, were secret, although governments usually had at least an idea of what each other's overall strategy would be. There was no great mystery as to who potential enemies were likely to be. France and Russia, despite major ideological differences, were known to be allies, driven together by Germany's threat to both of them. Germany was closely bound up with Austria-Hungary, and also was allied with the unreliable Italians, even though the Italians still harbored territorial claims against Austria. Great Britain, though preferring to remain neutral, was being impelled by the growth of German ambitions to draw closer to France and, for France's sake, to Russia. The various war crises of the early 20th century jolted the great powers into initiating joint staff talks with the armed forces of their allies. Secret army and navy discussions between Britain and France in 1905-06 and 1911 dealt with how to meet an attack by Germany. In 1908-09 similar talks were begun by the chiefs of the German and Austro-Hungarian general staffs and were focused on a possible war with Russia. Secret naval talks between Britain and Russia were authorized by the British cabinet in May 1914 and, when Berlin learned of them, terrified Germany. Such joint talks did not commit the European governments in a formal sense, yet in transforming theory into practice Europe's governments somehow took a further giant step on the road that led to 1914. And as it happened, they did define the war to come. They produced a script that in fact was to be followed. They provided a good indication of who would stay with which coalition. Germany and Austria would stick together, while Britain would decide to back France and Russia. Whether or not their accelerating arms race made conflict inevitable, as British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey claimed, the great powers of Europe somehow brought the event closer by engaging in what were essentially dress rehearsals for war, and not just for any war, but for the opening stages of the very war they were indeed about to wage. Was it fear of one another, driven by the arms race, and feeding on itself, that was pushing Europe to the brink? Or was it inborn aggression, pent up during the unnaturally long 4 decades of peace among the great powers, that now threatened to explode? Or were governments, as many were to say, deliberately maneuvering their countries toward war in order to distract attention from domestic problems that looked to be insoluble? Or were some governments pursuing aggressive or dangerous policies they should have known that other countries would be obliged to resist by force of arms? Whatever the reasons, as Helmut von Moltke, chief of Germany's general staff, told the civilian chancellor in a memorandum dated December 2, 1912, all sides are preparing for European war, which all sides expect sooner or later. War plans were criticized and changed in the light of experience gained in war games. They were updated in response to changing circumstances and to new information about enemy plans gleaned from espionage by the intelligence services. France was exceptional in that, on the eve of war, it modified its war plans in the light of a fashionable philosophy. The new French doctrine was that morale was the key to victory. It was a view derived from the teachings of military officers Ardent Dupic, 1821-70 and Ferdinand Foch, 1851-1929. That it was the moral rather than the material that ought to be emphasized seemed to be confirmed by the philosophy of Henri Bergson, 1859-1941, who saw in the élan vital, the life force, the energy that propelled evolution. These views lent themselves to the glorification of the attack, at the expense perhaps, of prudence, and that manifested themselves in the bias toward the offensive that many were to criticize later in Plan 17, the organizational and strategic plan adopted by France in May 1913. Some sources give his date of birth as 1831. Of all the strategies explored in advance by the military chiefs of the European powers, the one that was to figure most largely in later thinking about the war was the scheme named after Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the German general to whom the design was attributed. Schlieffen, 1833 to 1913, served as chief of Germany's Great General Staff from 1891 to 1906. The General Staff of the Prussian Army had been called Great since 1871, to distinguish it from the General Staffs of other states in the German Confederation, Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg. An elite body of about 650 officers, the Great General Staff served as the brains and nerve center of the army. In its first hypothetical war plan after German unification in 1871, the Great General Staff imagined a conflict in which the enemy consisted of a coalition of France, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. This, the most dangerous of possibilities, corresponded to the German nightmare of being surrounded, the Slav East and the Latin West against the center of Europe, in the words of Helmut von Moltke, known as Moltke the Elder, then Chief of the General Staff. From 1879 on, following the alliance agreement with Austria-Hungary, Germany's planning always made provision for a war against France and Russia, an unlikely combination on ideological grounds, for France was an advanced democracy and Russia was a backward tyranny. Driven together, against the odds, by the German threat, in 1894 France and Russia did indeed enter into an alliance, and Germany's war plans stopped being hypothetical. Successive chiefs of the Great General Staff asked not whether such a war would occur, but when. The difficult challenge that they faced, how to fight a two-front war successfully, had arisen because of the ineptness of their country's leaders in foreign policy. Moltke the Elder and his successor, Count Alfred von Waldersee, planned to fight Russia in a limited war that would compel the Tsar to make peace quickly, while at about the same time battling France with the objective of negotiating peace on favorable terms. It was a moderate strategy, defensive in spirit, aimed at coming out ahead. But it did mean splitting forces in order to fight both enemies at the same time. Count von Schlieffen took over as Chief of the General Staff on February 7, 1891. He was appointed despite his lack of combat experience. Lonely since the death of his wife, he was a solitary figure with narrow professional interests. He was a sarcastic officer whose twisted monocle made him look like the caricature of a Prussian. Schlieffen conducted what was almost a university for the officers under his command. He put them to work testing and reworking deployment plans annually in the light of what was learned in frequent war games and in horseback rides to study the terrain. Under his supervision, staff officers prepared 49 different overall strategic plans for the European war they believed was coming, 16 against France alone, 14 against Russia alone, and 19 against them together. In the event of a two-front war, Germany essentially had three choices. One of them, fighting France and Russia at the same time, seemed a risky strategy for an outnumbered Germany. Dealing with Russia first seemed impractical. The Russians, even if defeated, could retreat into the almost endless interior of their vast country. They could not be dealt a quick knockout blow. Moreover, the Russians were arming and building armies and railroads at a rapid pace. They were becoming more formidable opponents all the time. On the other hand, Schlieffen, as of 1905, held a low opinion of Russian military capabilities. A number of factors pointed to a strategy of engaging France first, and to the military mind, the only practical way for Germany to attack France was through neutral Belgium. Some officers in the French High Command understood this. In Britain, Winston Churchill knew it. He had learned it at a confidential briefing of Britain's Committee of Imperial Defence in 1911. The reasons for it had been explained to the committee by Major General Sir Henry Wilson, Director of Military Operations at the War Office. At the end of Schlieffen's tenure as Chief of Staff, he composed an informal memorandum outlining for his successor how such an invasion of France through Belgium might be done. The memorandum assumed that Germany had at its disposal for the hypothetical attack 90 divisions, at a time when only 70 were available. Does this mean that the memo was not really a proposal? Does it mean that it really was only a demonstration on paper that Germany needed a larger army than the War Ministry was willing to raise? Was it a document meant to persuade the War Ministry to change its mind? Whatever else it may have been, it served as a scenario, and probably is best viewed as such. The Schlieffen Memoranda of 1905–06 remain subjects of intense controversy. After the First World War came to an end, German generals who survived the war claimed that it had been lost only because dead colleagues had failed to follow to the letter an alleged secret Schlieffen plan that would have proved a guide to victory. Their claim was in large part accepted. The plan supposedly called for almost the entire German army to constitute a right arm, a right flank, that would drive to the Dutch and Belgian coasts, and then sweep down to envelop western France, then turn and scoop up Paris on the way to a decisive victory east of Paris, a victory over a French army that at that point would be completely surrounded. France would be destroyed forever as a great power. It all would have taken a matter of weeks, and the German army would then have been transferred east to deal with Russia. Throughout the 20th century, and now into the 21st, historians have debated the consequences of the so-called Schlieffen Plan. Its rigid timetable supposedly forced Germany to initiate the war when and as it did. The course of events in the summer of 1914 often is pictured as an example of automation, as though the government of Berlin were caught up in the grip of its own unchangeable secret plan. We now can see that any such account is a distorted one. We have scholarly resources not available generations ago. Schlieffen's papers, carried off by Americans, were discovered in Washington, D.C., in 1953 in the National Archives. After the pioneering research of Gerhard Ritter in the 1950s, lucidly seconded in 2001 by John Keegan, it became clear that, whatever else it might have been, the Schlieffen Memorandum of 1905, with its 1906 supplement, was not a plan. It was not operational. It did not go into details or issue orders. It can be viewed in context by reading a selection of Schlieffen's military writings, which has just appeared in English translation by Robert T. Foley. A further challenge, mounted as this is being written, is the publication of Inventing the Schlieffen Plan by Terence Zubair. Based on archival material that he tells us has not been used before, Zubair argues that even the memoranda we speak of as embodying the Schlieffen strategy proposal, do not express his actually proposed strategies and his war plans and ideas. Of course Germany did invade France through Belgium, as Schlieffen's memorandum imagined it would do. But that was pursuant to what with more accuracy should be called the Moltke Plan, for it was during Moltke's tenure of office that the operational document, the actual plan for invading France, was promulgated. Reviewing the Schlieffen Memoranda some 5 years later, in 1911, Moltke indicated in his notes that he agreed that France should be invaded through Belgium. The decision exercised a sort of multiplier effect on Germany's quarrels. In the context of Germany's post-1890 foreign policy, it created the very encircling coalition Germans professed to fear. It also automatically transformed a German war into a European war that as a result would become a world war. If Germany attacked Russia, Germany would start by invading Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, thereby bringing them, too, into the war, thus also bringing Great Britain into the war, bringing in addition, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and others too, possibly including Britain's Pacific ally, Japan. All of this rousing up of additional enemies was undertaken in pursuance of a strategy that, even in the words of a scholar who believes in the existence of the Schlieffen scheme, never achieved the final, perfected form that is sometimes imputed to it. Schlieffen envisaged violating the neutrality of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland in invading France. Moltke decided instead to leave Holland alone. In the first place, Dutch armed resistance might tip the scales against the invaders. In the second, if a war of attrition developed, Germany would need a neutral Netherlands as a conduit for supplies. These were both good reasons for respecting Dutch neutrality. One of the consequences of doing so, however, was to narrow the invasion route through which the German forces were to move. It would be a corridor 12 miles wide. It could be dominated by the Belgian fortifications at Liege. So, relying on total surprise and a sprinter's speed, German forces would have to seize Liege before the enemy even knew that war was upon them. All this would be possible only if there was complete secrecy. Moltke therefore did not allow even Germany's other military leaders, let alone the civilian ones, to share this information. One other point later, in the summer of 1914, assumed great importance. The increased speed of Russia's mobilization ability, and the strengthening of its armed forces, meant that in the event of war, Germany on its own might not have the ability to ward off Russia's first blow. It would have to call on Austria-Hungary to help. That was to prove a key to understanding the crisis of July 1914. In the unified German Federation that Prussia had organized into a single power in the wars of the 1860s and 1870s, the armed forces played a disproportionately large role and, through it, so did the King of Prussia, who served not only as German Emperor, but also as military chief. As Chancellor, Germany's civilian leader, Otto von Bismarck wore a military uniform, seeking to identify himself with the military service and thereby indicating where he, who had created the new state and was the author of its constitution, believed that power rested. Vested in the Kaiser were almost dictatorial powers in the great matters of war and peace, almost, but not quite. His was the power to declare war or to make peace, so long as he could obtain the countersignature of the Chancellor. But as the Chancellor was appointed by the Kaiser and served at his pleasure, this did not provide much of a check on the monarch's power. In the Imperial German army, the Kaiser served as supreme warlord. Immediately below him were three distinct bodies that sometimes competed with one another: the Prussian War Ministry, the War Cabinet, and the Great General Staff. Their functions were separate but sometimes overlapping. They, too, were appointed by the Kaiser. It often was said, after he was made chief of the Great General Staff in 1906, that the younger Moltke had been chosen because Wilhelm liked him. Moltke's biographer, Annika Mombauer, in a recently published work based in part on previously unknown primary sources, tells us that he had been the Kaiser's friend as well as his long-term adjutant, that as a young man he was a tall, dashing military figure, and that his pleasant manners and varied cultural pursuits made him an appealing candidate. Born in East Prussia, Moltke came of the right stock. His candidacy cannot have been hurt by the fact that he was a nephew of the great Moltke, Moltke the Elder, as he was known subsequently, the commander of Bismarck's armies who, in defeating Denmark, Austria, and then France, had been the general whose victories created modern Germany. The nephew knew what he owed to his uncle's name. On the occasion of his general staff appointment, he asked Wilhelm, "Does your Majesty really believe that you will win the first prize twice in the same lottery?" Big and heavy, he was 58 years old at the time of his appointment. Although he painted, played the cello, and took an interest in spiritualist matters, he held conventional military and political views. Goethe's Faust is said to have been his constant companion, but it would have taken much more than his rather ordinary intellect to suspect that Faust might bear some relevance to the bid for total power that Prussia was mounting in his time. Appreciating that Austria was of vital importance to his plans, Moltke worked with his Austrian counterpart, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, to strengthen the Austro-German alliance. He succeeded in restoring warmth to a relationship that had been strained. Both chiefs of staff, it transpired nonetheless, held back and failed to give their entire confidence to one another. Moltke did not reveal the extent of his need for Austrian assistance in meeting the initial Russian attack that he expected. Conrad, in turn, did not admit that Austria was going to focus on destroying Serbia and would hope Germany, by itself, would assume full responsibility for dealing with the Tsar's armies. Until recently, the common view among scholars, especially in Germany, has been that Moltke was inadequate, weak, and of less than major importance. The appearance of Mombauer's biography should change that view. Moltke was a figure of considerable significance both for what he did and for what he did not do. As a favorite of the Kaiser's who therefore was in a position to get a hearing for his views, Moltke took the lead in advancing two propositions. First, that the alliance with Austria was absolutely central to Germany and had to be given top priority. And second, that war against the Triple Entente, Britain, France and Russia, three countries that had pledged mutual friendship, was bound to break out not much later than 1916 or 1917, and that Germany would lose the war unless it launched a preventive attack immediately. Certain that war would come, Moltke wanted it sooner rather than later. He wanted it even though, like many of his colleagues, he feared that it would bring European civilization to an end.